Hi, like I said, my name is Kyle Waters. I am a software engineering manager at Revo Acceptance. We are a Vue shop. I've been very happy about that. I love Vue. It's I just find it a lot easier. Whoops, there we go. Okay, so we're going to talk about Vue directives today. We're going to start off talking about some of the common Vue directives, some uncommon Vue directives, and some custom Vue directives. To explain what Vue directives are, I will just jump to the first slide and show my example. So these are the most common built-in ones if you've ever used Vue. I suspect you've used all of these. I seem to use them on almost every component I build. So the first one I have here is vModel. This is the two-way binding. So if you want to bind a variable or a property in this component to the child, to one in the child component, you use vModel. So I've done that here with this input. So anything I type in here will be bound to the value property. vOn, this is for binding to events, binding a function to an event. So I have bound it to update the action property to say focused on when we focus. vOn has a shortcut called just the @ symbol. So you see I use that here instead. So when I blur, it'll update to blurred. Usually we use the @ I prefer the shortcuts when they exist. So you see on this next one for disabled. So I've bound the disabled attribute to the disable input property. I could have vbind here in front of the colon, but you don't need it. Colon is the shortcut for vbind. So if I hit disabled, now that field's disabled, I can re-enable it. We also have the vif and velse. I only have vif on here, but you could use velse on the other component you want it to show instead. But when I click hide, it's going to hide it. So there's, and it just does not render it. So if you go and you look at the DOM, that input is now gone. And now it's back. And I mention that because there's also something called vShow. vShow will just set display to none. So we have here, I have v4. v4 will render based off an array. So it's going to iterate through that array. The array has the numbers 1 through 4 in it. So it iterates through. I've hidden number 3. Normally you wouldn't do that. You would just filter out based off using a computed property, but I wanted to demonstrate vShow. But if we were to pull up the DOM inspector, we would see that 3 in there, but it would be set, the display styling would be set to none. Okay, oh yeah, vSlot. So when you're designing a component, you can use a slot element to drop in the content that's inside the child element tags on the parent. So you'd have your child component in the parent, and you just put stuff in here, and it'll automatically show up in the slot element. Well, what if you have a template where you have 2 different places you want to drop stuff in? Well, you can name those slots, and then you just use vSlot then you use the template tag and vSlot to identify the name in the child element. And you can either use v-slot, or again, we have a shortcut, the hashtag. Now some less common directives. I have never used these outside of this presentation. There's a vtext one, which will just drop. So yeah, here I have the input. I have a vModel set to value. And so with vtext, it just sets the content to whatever the value is in that variable. With vHTML, it will actually render that content. I'll show that in a second. If you do vpre, it'll just show you what's in there. Much like the pre tag. So you can use the 2 of those together in order to put in your curly braces and Vue code demos. So I did have to use it here. And then v-once will only render the element once. And so if you update it later, it won't update. So let's show an example. I'm going to come here. So vtext, it shows the text exactly as it is. VHTML, it renders it. This, of course, doesn't change, and this one, the v_once, didn't change either. And somewhat related to v_once, there is the v_memo. So if you have, so if you use v_memo, you set an array of variables or properties that it should watch for a change, and it will only render changes if you change those ones. So in this one, I have a div with v_memo, and in the array is the parameter or property last name. But then also in the rendering is first name and last name. So when I change first name here, nothing changes. But as soon as I change last name, that will force a render update, and it will render everything that's changed. So that's it for the built-in ones I'm going to demonstrate today. So next we're going to move on to custom directives. These custom directives are often used for validation and/or masking, permissions, tooltips, adding new events like hover, scroll, click off, and another really simple and common one is focus. So we'll go through those. So yeah, masking is a really common one. There are libraries you can go out and get that will allow you just to pass in a regex for masking. As here, I've created one for typing in a hex number. So I have vhex attribute set on this input element, and so when I go and I try to type anything that's not in my list here, it deletes it. So it calls in. So when you create a directive, you have kind of the same life cycles you do with a component. So here I have the mounted hook, and so I create this function that will uppercase the value of the target, and then it will run a replace, so it will replace anything that's not a valid hex number. And then we add that as an event listener. So on input for this element, we're going to run our handler. So it deletes those letters as I type them, but if I hit A, it'll uppercase it and put it in. So you can create these if there's anything you're using a lot of. Maybe there's money formatting, or I know phone numbers and emails now, there's some standards there, but if you have a different way of doing it or whatever, you can create one of this and just reuse it throughout your app. You can create your directives globally and reuse them. So this one, vResource is, so this is set up on mounting. We check to see, we're checking against the user property and in the component and against their resource list. And so we're going to check and see against this binding value, which is, the value is this right here. So do they have access to the appointments resource? And then we can also pass in this binding argument right after the colon, this disable and hide. So in the one case, if they don't have access, we disable, and in the other case, we hide it, so it's not there. But yeah, this one I can't use. So you can set this up and then put it on all your inputs and have a resource-based permission systems on your front end very easily, and just reuse that throughout your app. Another common usage is to create a tooltip. This is pretty easily done through CSS, but you can reduce a little bit of boilerplate by using a directive. So all we do is we set up for it to add the classes automatically, and so then in our CSS we have all the hover stuff and that sort of things. So, but again, you can use all those arguments and values and things to make, if you want to say, well, do this one top or this one left or this one bottom, you can set those as arguments that can be passed in. Okay, so if you want to create a hover event, there's a lot of stuff, events that are already built in, like click and blur and focus. But hover's not one that's standard, but you can add it with the directive so that you have vHover. So, I don't think it's working in full screen mode. But yeah, again, you just mount, you create your event, and then you can do add your event listener. And you can set this up on unmount, so it will unbind that as well. So it does save you a little bit there. Oh, let's see here. Yeah, there it goes. So we also have click off. This is really useful for when you're doing like modals and things like that. To add a click off event. And so if you see, when I click here, it doesn't do anything, but when I click over here, it'll add to that queue. So again, just in the mounted, we create our function and add the event listener. And then you'd set the value in the directive to the function that you wanted to call when someone clicks somewhere else. And then for our last one, we have focus, which is really straightforward and simple. You just have it focus on the element, but again, it just makes it a lot easier. It's easier just to type that attribute in there, v-focus, and you can reuse that all over in your app. I don't know about you, but I create a lot of forms as a web developer. So you can see here, it's I've got v-focus on this middle one automatically. Okay, do I have any questions? All right, thank you.